Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Years ago, St. Louis piloted an innovative program pairing police officers with social workers, but it came to an abrupt halt for all too predictable reasons. We explored that history on today's St. Louis on the Air.
Back in the 80s, there was all kinds of federal money that came down to police departments for social service and community action programs. Since then it's all been turned into buying tanks and guns and bigger cars, etc. But back in the 80s, there was money for that. When that money ran out, then they didn't want to pay for it.
I'm Sarah Fensky. This is St. Louis on the Air. And before we move on, I want to remind you that the biggest source of St. Louis Public Radio's funding comes from listeners like you. Because you value what you hear on St. Louis on the Air, donate today. Go to stlpr.org/donate. That's stlpr.org/donate. A few weeks ago, we discussed on this show the launch of a new program called Cops and Clinicians. After a very limited pilot, the city of St. Louis is gearing up to start diverting some 911 calls to mental health professionals by January. It will also begin to pair social workers with police officers in responding to certain calls. The program represents a big change for St. Louis policing, but in some ways, it's nothing new. Decades ago, the city launched a pilot program that used social workers to respond to certain calls. It had a 3-year run before being jettisoned. So what happened? The city seems to never talk about this program today. We only found out about it from 2 of our listeners who reached out via our St. Louis on the Air Facebook page when we were talking about this, Cops and Clinicians. They heard our discussion and wanted to supply some context. It was great context, and we wanted to know more, so we thought we'd go straight to the source. Amy Hilgemann is a retired mental health and crisis intervention professional. She ran the city's previous program, and she joins us today. So, Amy Hilgemann, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon.
I'm so glad that you're able to join us to share this important context about this program that you ran, and this was, again, back in the 80s. Set the scene for us. How did you get involved with this program back in the day?
Well, I had been working at Life Crisis, which was a call-in crisis line, and served the metropolitan area. So a job came up, and I applied for the job at Magdala Foundation to be a program director for the crisis program in the police departments. We had offices in 2 different, back then they had 9 districts. We had offices in the 3rd and the 7th district, which put us in North St. Louis and South St. Louis.
Okay, so 1 in North, 1 in South. And I understand this program was called Crisis Intervention Services. So as part of this program, how did you end up interacting with police and taking these calls?
Well, we had a set protocol, which everybody in the police department operates under protocols. So each person, we had 2 people working per shift, carried a police radio. We had identification numbers that they would call on the radio, which means they were trying to contact us. We were 8313 and 8713. And then a police officer would let the complaint evaluator know that they needed a social worker, which we were all master's level, a social worker to come to assist them at the scene. Sometimes they would tell us if it was a homeless person or a mentally ill person. Sometimes they didn't tell us anything. So then we would respond to the address that they gave us and meet the police officers at the home.
Okay, so you would meet the police officers there. What happened then, and generally? I'm sure every call had its own nuances, but what would be next for your protocol?
So what we did was the police officers usually came out and met us and gave us a description of what the encounter was. So we would go in with them. They would introduce us to the family or the individual, and sometimes they would stay. Usually they'd stay a few minutes just to make sure everything was calm, and then they would leave. And they would code the call to us, and we would know that we were there to deal with whatever the situation was. And we had all kinds of situations, mentally ill people that we needed to take to back then Knucklebliss for commitment, people that were walkaways from nursing homes that could take hours and hours and hours for police to figure out where did they come from. We would do that. In the summer, we did a lot of neighborhood disputes, which meant, 2 or 3 families were having a big commotion out in the street, and the police were called. And what we did on those, because there were so many people involved, was we had the paddy wagon come out, and we brought everybody to the station. And then we would just have a big group meeting. And, a lot of times when you did stuff like that, you found out that the whole thing was about 2 kids that were 4 years old fighting over a stick. The next thing you know, you had 3 families in a big brawl in the street. So one of the things that we did that they really appreciated was there's people who call the police a lot. Mm-hmm. And there's people who call for ambulances a lot. And it may or may not be for a need. And they would give us those cases, and those we were very successful in ameliorating why people, would call the police. And if it was a mental health issue, we would get the services that they needed, or if it was just somebody that needed a better way to get medical services, which sometimes that was involving family. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we did do on our cases is that we always did a follow-up. So 5 to 7 days later, we would make contact with the family again to make sure that they were able to access the referrals that we made, or if they discovered that they had other things that they needed.
Okay. So, this sounds great, but the part where my brain is kind of getting stuck is you're saying the police would just walk away. They determined that this was then your call. You guys were handling things from there. In some cases, you're dealing with feuding neighbors. Did things ever get dangerous for you social workers there on the scene?
Well, one time we got a call from 2 police officers in the 7th District, and they wanted us they had gotten a call for an elderly lady. And, back when there were 9 districts, police officers actually kind of knew the people in the community because they worked in smaller areas. And they knew this woman. And they said she calls a lot and she calls about nothing, so why don't you guys just go out there? And we said, no, that's not how it works. You go there, and then you call us, and we'll see what we can do. Well, they get there, and she shoots them, both of them.
Oh, my goodness. The old
woman? They had on their vests. They were fine. They were just a few injuries. But that could have been us, So, it was really required that they go there first.
They go there
on
first.
Cases that you wouldn't think, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, but it does seem like there's a key difference between the way you guys did this in the 80s and what I'm hearing from the city that they envision today. And that is the fact that the officers would leave after they'd been there a couple minutes in the program
right.
you guys had. You guys took things from there. What was the thinking on that, not having the officers stick around?
Well, it defeats the purpose. It's not a police matter. All of a sudden, it's turned over to us because it's no longer a police matter. People call the police for things that they don't know who else to call. Mm-hmm. And, it's 7 o'clock at night. You don't know what to do, or, 11 o'clock at night. So people call the police, and they end up dealing, and there's statistics on this. I don't know what the recent ones are, but they deal with so many non-police matters. And that's what ties up their time. So we were able, and they were able to prove, because these cases were coded to us, we could prove how much time we saved by taking examples of cases that had the same kind of call code that they didn't call us, and how long it took the officer to ameliorate the situation as opposed to us getting there, taking them back, putting them back on the street, and us handling it. So it did save, and right now, police are, screaming that they don't have enough police officers, or they can't find them, they can't. Mm-hmm. This is a program that truly would allow the police officer to do police work and not do social work. And I think that, most importantly, this is the type of program that Black Lives Matters is asking for. This is what people really need, some way to access social services, and not just, I've been a social worker my whole life. I've been an administrator. I've done direct practice. You can refer somebody somewhere, and that doesn't mean they get the service. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, as a social worker, you got to go in and knock down and kick in another social service door to make sure that your client gets the service. And that's what we would do by doing our follow-ups. We were there to guarantee that people got what they needed.
Well, Amy, you make such a great case, and this wasn't theoretical for you. You were there on the ground doing this work. I guess where I get stuck is, What happened to this program? It seems like the city was onto something decades before people are talking about how we need social workers handling these calls. St. Louis was doing it. Do you have any idea why the city pulled the plug?
Well, in the beginning, they didn't actually pay for the service. The service was contracted through federal grant funds. Back in the 80s, there was all kinds of federal money that came down to police departments for social service and community action programs. Since then, it's all been turned into buying tanks and guns and bigger cars, et cetera. But back in the 80s, there was money for that. When that money ran out, then they didn't want to pay for it.
The city didn't want to have to use its own funds for that.
No, the police department. It wasn't the city then. The police department was a separate entity governed by a separate board that didn't have any city control. So they got their budget through the legislature. They didn't even want to ask for the money for it.
And Amy, you make a great point. I had forgotten this, and shame on me for forgetting this. But yeah, back in the 80s, the city did not have local control of its police department. Right. They answered to this state board. And as you say, they did not even want to ask for the funding on this. It's interesting because, as you say, it sounds like this was sparing police officers from the kind of calls that, frankly, from talking to cops don't enjoy these kind of calls. There's as you say, a lot of work that goes into this. And it sounds like you were able to take these off their plate. Any sense of what would have been the holdup, why they wouldn't have been happy to try to steer this to social workers instead?
Well, I don't think I need to explain it. We need to look at what the problem is right now with police departments across the country. They want to protect what they have. Mm-hmm. They do not want to spend any money in any other programs, even though there's a cry from city after city after city. So it's the same old protect your own.
That this maybe felt like a threat to them continuing to have the staffing.
They can buy more. They they thought they could get more police officers, or they could get more cars. The program didn't cost much. It really didn't. And we were paid. Even police officers don't make much money, but we did not make more than they did. So
yes, social workers are not known for their giant salaries. So.
Right. No, it's just a mindset that existed then, and it exists now. So the police department could have set up a program like this, but they didn't want to because they didn't want to spend the money. So what do? They have a social worker ride around with a police officer. That defeats the whole purpose. Who decides what calls are taken? Who decides how long the social worker stays on the call? Who's in charge?
Yeah.
The police officer. So that's not a crisis program.
So you have some real concerns about what you're hearing about how this new program is set up.
Right. If somebody came into your home as a social worker and the cop is sitting there wagging his foot at the door, waiting for you to get done, would you feel like you were having the proper kind of social service intervention? No.
Yeah. That seems like that's a real problem. And something else I wonder about is the idea of intimidation, that some people are just nervous about speaking frankly in front of a police officer.
Right, exactly.
Did you find in the calls that you took that after the police officers left that maybe families were able to open up more about certain types of needs or issues with social workers?
I would say that sometimes the call that we got for the problem was really the tip of the iceberg, and they were not about to explain that to the police because they didn't really they wanted some help, but they didn't know what else to do. Like for instance, we had a call where there was some teenage kids in the basement. I think it was on Russell. And they were playing Russian roulette with their dad's gun. And one of them got their head blown off. And so the cops go out there, of course, and then they call for us because the parents were so distraught. Everybody, it was just chaos. And they were trying to maintain control and get, the coroner and all this stuff out there, or the medical. And they called us to come in and to try to calm down the family. The other family of the other kids were there. And so it was just an assistance so that we could pull these people aside while they actually did the crime scene. Mm-hmm. And so there's just a lot of things that we could do that, there wasn't really any remedy for the parents. There wasn't any, we weren't going to have any cathartic, gee whiz, it happened. We just wanted to give the officers the ability to do the job on the police part. So there's just a lot of things that can be done. And, one of the things that we really had to work at was educating the officers about using the program, because some of them didn't know how, some of them never used it, some of them used it all the time. So really different officers had different feelings about it. So we always had to work on educating the officers and really trying to spend some time. We would go to the different roll calls. We ended up working citywide, so we handled cases all over. And so we'd go to the roll calls and talk to the officers. And, we did that at least once a month just to continue to, if we weren't in the 5th District, they weren't going to think about us as much because we didn't have an office there. So we tried to really do a lot of work with, establishing relationships with the officers.
Well, Amy, hearing about this experience, it just seems remarkable. And boy, it just seems like the city lost decades. We could have been so far ahead of the curve. And here we are just starting from scratch again and starting in some ways that, frankly, you are very skeptical about whether or not they're even going to work. In our final minute here, what is the one thing you'd hope to convey to people who are thinking about this program today and thinking about the experience that you had back in the day? What would you hope people take away from this conversation?
That we need to integrate into the police department a program that's whole purpose is to help people get the services, social services, mental health services that they need. And it's obviously a need. It's come up across the country. It's just critical. And I would hope that people would, say this is what we need and maybe put their words to their alderman or to the mayor.
Mm-hmm. Well, Amy
or
Hilgemann.
Our next mayor. Whichever it is.
Well, Amy Hilgemann, you've provided such a valuable perspective here today. I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing this information.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It was a nice honor. Thank you.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.